They say, a wedding is supposed to be the happiest day of a person's life, a celebration of love, unity, and a perfect beginning. But for one bride, the altar didn't become a place of joy, became a stage for one of the most shocking and humiliating scandals her family, her groom, and her entire community had ever witnessed. As the church bells rang and guests rose to their feet, all eyes turned to the young bride in her flawless white gown. She smiled, though her trembling hands gave away her nerves. The groom stood tall and proud, ready to seal his vows. Everything looked perfect, at least from the outside, but when the priest asked the question every bride waits to hear, "Do you take this man to be your husband?" Silence filled the air. The bride's face turned pale, her lips quivered, and before a single word could leave her mouth, she suddenly doubled over. To the horror of everyone present, she vomited right there on the altar, just seconds before she was supposed to say, "I do." What happened next would unravel secrets darker than anyone could have ever imagined. The morning of the wedding began like a scene pulled from a fairy tale. The church was decorated with white roses, candles flickered gently against the stained glass windows, and a string quartet tuned their instruments in the corner. Guests whispered in admiration, marveling at the grandeur of the ceremony. From the outside, everything looked flawless, an image of love, wealth, and perfection. The groom stood at the altar in a sharp black suit, smiling confidently as friends clapped him on the back. He seemed proud, ready to claim the woman beside him as his bride. To the guests, he looked like a man who had it all: charm, success, and a wedding that promised to be remembered for years to come. But in the bride's chamber, the atmosphere was different. Hidden behind a veil of lace, she sat quietly while bridesmaids adjusted her gown. Her face carried a practiced smile, but her eyes betrayed unease. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her bouquet, and though she nodded politely at the chatter around her, her mind was far away. Every bride feels nervous, people would say, but this was something more. Deep down, she wasn't just anxious, she was conflicted. This was supposed to be her dream wedding, yet the weight of expectation pressed down like chains. Family honor, social image, and the cost of the grand ceremony all demanded that she walk down the aisle, whether she truly wanted to or not. When the organ began to play and the church doors swung open, all eyes turned to her. Gasps of admiration filled the air as she stepped forward, radiant in her white gown. Guests smiled, believing they were witnessing a love story at its peak, but the truth was hidden behind her forced smile, a secret carried in her every step. With each pace toward the altar, the pressure mounted. By the time she reached the groom's side, her heart was racing, her breaths uneven. No one else noticed. To the crowd, this was still the perfect wedding. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming, cracks that would soon erupt in the most shocking way imaginable. This was not the beginning of a happily ever after. It was the beginning of a scandal. Every grand wedding hides a story the guests will never know. While people smiled, raised their glasses, and gossiped about the expensive decor, no one could imagine the truth buried beneath the bride's fragile smile. Her story did not begin at the altar, began months before, with an engagement that was never truly hers to choose. The bride came from a respected family, one that valued reputation above all else. When the groom, a wealthy businessman with a polished reputation, proposed, her parents were quick to agree. It was the perfect match, they said. To families of equal status, wealth secured, and appearances preserved, she was reminded again and again that many women would envy her position. But envy was the last thing she felt, in private. She often cried at night, her heart torn between duty and desire. Friends noticed her hesitation, but whenever they asked, she brushed it off with nervous laughter. Her family made it clear, backing out of the marriage was not an option. Too much money had been spent, too many invitations had been sent, and too much honor was at stake. She tried to convince herself it would work, that maybe love would grow in time, that maybe the groom's controlling nature was just confidence. But as the wedding drew closer, the weight on her chest only grew heavier. By the time the dress fittings began, she had developed nervous habits, chewing her nails until they bled, twisting her hands until her skin turned red. At rehearsal dinners, her smile was wide, but her eyes were vacant. Guests mistook it for cold feet, but inside, she knew the truth. This was not the man she wanted to marry. On the morning of the wedding, while others fussed over her hair and veil, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes, framed by flawless makeup, carried a silent plea. She whispered to herself, "I can't do this," but no one heard her, and yet, she walked down the aisle. Because sometimes, the expectations of family and society feel heavier than the voice inside your own heart. What no one realized was that the secret she carried was not just doubt, it was rebellion. Somewhere deep within, she was searching for a way out, desperate for escape. She may not have planned what would happen at the altar, but her body would betray her secret in the most unforgettable way. The cracks in her facade were already spreading, and soon they would explode into chaos. To the outside world, the groom was everything a bride could want. Handsome, successful, and respected. He walked with confidence, spoke with charm, and knew how to win people over. Guests at the wedding whispered about his wealth, his business connections, and the grand life he could offer. But behind the polished smile was a man few truly knew. In private, the groom's confidence often turned into control. He liked things his way, every detail, every decision, even the smallest choices. What the bride wore, who she spoke to, how she carried herself, everything had to reflect well on him. Too many, this was hidden as protectiveness, but in reality, it was dominance disguised as care. There were whispers in his past, too. Old acquaintances remembered him as short-tempered, with a tendency to lash out when things didn't go his way. An ex-girlfriend once described him as charming at first, but suffocating in the end. Yet none of this mattered to the families. His reputation, his wealth, and his spotless public image outweighed any warnings. The bride, trapped in silence, knew the man she was marrying wasn't the same one the world admired. She had seen his true face, the controlling tone, the sharp glances, the way he reminded her that leaving him would ruin everything. So when she stood beside him at the altar, his hand resting firmly over hers, she felt not comfort but pressure. He smiled for the crowd, but she felt the weight of his grip tighten, as if to remind her, there is no escape. And yet, her body was already searching for one. The church was silent. The guests had taken their seats. The music faded, and the bride now stood beside her groom. All eyes were fixed on the couple, waiting for the words that would seal their union forever. The priest's voice echoed gently through the church, steady and calm. He spoke of love, loyalty, and the sanctity of marriage. The groom smiled proudly, his chest lifted with pride, squeezing the bride's hand just a little tighter as if to remind her of the part she was expected to play. The bride, however, was far from steady. Her palms were clammy beneath her gloves, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The veil hid her pale face from the guests, but beneath it, her lips trembled. Each word from the priest felt like a chain being wrapped around her, pulling tighter, closing in. Then came the question, do you take this man to be your lawful husband? To love him, honor him, and cherish him, for as long as you both shall live. The church fell into a heavy silence. Guests leaned forward, smiling, waiting for the bride's joyful "I do." But the words never came. Her heart pounded violently. Her stomach churned, and her knees weakened. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Instead, her face twisted, her body bent forward, and in a moment that stunned everyone, she vomited across the altar steps. Gasps echoed through the church. Some guests covered their mouths in shock, Others whispered in disbelief. The groom's expression froze, his smile collapsing into horror and rage. The priest stumbled back, his words cut short, unable to mask his disgust. The perfect wedding had shattered in an instant. The bride collapsed to her knees, tears mixing with humiliation. For her, it wasn't just sickness, it was release. Her body had betrayed her secret, rejecting the very moment she was supposed to embrace. The guests would remember it as a scandal. The groom would remember it as humiliation. But for the bride, it was the first step toward freedom. For a moment, the church froze. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the sharp echo of the bride's retching, and the collective gasp of hundreds of stunned guests. Then whispers began to ripple through the pews. What just happened? Did she really? My God, at the altar. Some guests covered their faces, horrified by the scene, while others stifled laughter at the sheer absurdity of it. The bridesmaids rushed forward, fumbling with tissues, trying desperately to clean the mess. But the damage was already done. The sacred altar, a symbol of purity and unity, had become the stage of utter humiliation. The groom's face turned red with fury. His jaw clenched, his hand balled into a fist at his side. He didn't move to comfort her, didn't kneel to help. Instead, he stood stiff, his pride crumbling under the weight of 100 watching eyes. For a man who thrived on control, this public disaster was unforgivable. The priest cleared his throat awkwardly, murmuring prayers under his breath, as if to restore dignity to the scene. But dignity was long gone. The wedding guests began exchanging glances, some shaking their heads, others pulling out their phones to record the chaos. Within moments, the whispers turned to murmurs, and the murmurs into quiet laughter. The bride, still on her knees, covered her face with trembling hands. Tears streamed down her cheeks, blurring her vision as her chest heaved with sobs. This was more than embarrassment. It was the crushing weight of months of fear, anxiety, and suppressed truth bursting out in the worst possible way. And then, she did the unthinkable. She rose unsteadily to her feet, her gown stained, her veil tilted. Without looking at the groom, without a word to the priest, she turned and began walking down the aisle away from the altar, away from the vows, away from the life that had been forced upon her. The guests gasped again, some calling after her, others too stunned to react. The groom shouted her name, his voice dripping with rage. But she didn't turn back. For the first time, the bride wasn't playing her part. She was walking toward freedom, leaving a shattered wedding and a stunned congregation behind her. The church doors had barely closed behind the fleeing bride when the scandal began to spread. In the modern age, no humiliation stays private for long, and this one was too outrageous to be ignored. Within minutes, the glow of phone screens filled the church pews. Guests who had secretly recorded the incident now watched in disbelief as the bride's collapse replayed over and over. Some laughed nervously, others whispered in shock, but many hit send without a second thought. By the time the wedding guests stepped outside the video, she said "I don't" the hard way. On Twitter, memes spread like wildfire. The wedding diet gone wrong, one read, with a screenshot of the bride on her knees. By nightfall, hashtags like #VomitBride and #AltarGate were trending. For the groom's family, it was a disaster. Their carefully curated reputation, polished over years of business deals and social appearances, was now being dragged through the mud in comment sections filled with ridicule. Every clip, every meme, every cruel joke made it clear. Their son had not walked away from his wedding with dignity. He had walked away with infamy for the bride's family. The humiliation was unbearable. Relatives called nonstop, demanding explanations. Some blamed her, calling her weak and irresponsible. Others whispered that perhaps she had done it on purpose to shame the groom. Rumors piled on top of rumors, each one uglier than the last. But amidst the chaos, something unexpected happened. Strangers, online, women especially, began to see her not as a joke, but as a symbol. They asked, what could drive a bride to such a breaking point? Threads appeared questioning forced marriages, toxic relationships, and the crushing weight of family expectations. What looked like humiliation was being reinterpreted by many as rebellion. While the world laughed, others saw the truth. The vomit wasn't just sickness. It was a cry for freedom. The scandal had gone public. But soon, the real story would too. In the days following the disastrous wedding, rumors spread faster than facts. Was it food poisoning? A sudden illness? Or had the bride intentionally staged her collapse? Everyone had their own version of the story. But the truth was far more complicated and far darker than anyone had imagined. Behind closed doors, those closest to her finally began to talk. A bridesmaid admitted that the bride had been unusually quiet in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Another relative revealed that she had broken down crying the night before, whispering, "I can't go through with this." These weren't the jitters of a nervous bride, these were the cracks of someone being pushed into a life she didn't want. The reality was painful. The bride had been trapped in an arrangement she never chose. The marriage wasn't about love, it was about image. The groom's wealth, the family's reputation, and the illusion of a perfect union meant more to her parents than her happiness. Every time she tried to resist, she was reminded of the shame and scandal it would bring if she backed out. Her body, pushed beyond its limits, had made the choice for her. The vomiting wasn't just a physical reaction, it was her subconscious rebelling against the vow she couldn't bring herself to speak. It was the moment her silence transformed into an undeniable truth. She did not want this marriage, and as the whispers grew louder, even the groom's image began to crack. Old acquaintances stepped forward, speaking of his controlling nature and explosive temper. The polished facade of the perfect husband-to-be was replaced by suspicion, doubt, and scandal. At last, the bride's story came into focus. She wasn't weak. She wasn't a joke. She was a woman crushed by expectations, yet strong enough, if only through one shocking act, to break free. The truth had finally come out. But for the bride, the question now was simple. Would she let this scandal define her as a victim? Or would she transform it into her liberation? The scandal could have destroyed her. For weeks, the bride's name was mocked online, her face turned into memes, her story twisted into cruel jokes. Families whispered, reporters called, and the weight of humiliation hung heavy in the air. Many expected her to disappear into silence, to live forever in the shadow of that disastrous moment at the altar. But instead of breaking, she began to rebuild. In the quiet aftermath, she refused to return to the groom. Despite pressure from relatives who begged her to make things right, she knew there was nothing right about that marriage, nothing true about the vows she was expected to make. Walking away hadn't been her plan, but it became her choice. For the first time, she chose herself. Slowly, her voice grew louder. She confided in close friends, then in strangers online who had defended her. She shared her truth that she had been forced into a marriage she never wanted, that the perfect groom was not who he pretended to be, and that her breakdown at the altar was her body's desperate way of saying no. The story shifted. What had begun as scandal turned into something else, a symbol of defiance. Her act, once mocked as weakness, was reframed as courage. She became too many, the bride who chose freedom over fear, dignity over pretense. As for the groom, his carefully polished image never fully recovered. The whispers of his temper, his controlling ways, and the humiliation of that public rejection followed him everywhere. In the end, the bride had taken away the one thing he valued most. She